Good morning. The title of this sermon is All Five Fingers. I don't usually give sermons titles. I sometimes think it's kind of hokey, but this one is important. The title of it is All Five Fingers. Okay, so in the Old Testament, in the Torah, in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, there is a legal principle that is introduced. The legal principle ends up being called the lex talionis. Anybody know what lex talionis means? Extra credit if you do. It's a law of retribution. The talion is retribution or revenge. You might not know its legal name, its specific name, lex talionis, but you absolutely know what that law is. Eye for an eye. Familiar? Eye for an eye. And what that means is, in the Old Testament, and by the way, the Old Testament did not invent lex talionis. We actually find it in some other ancient Mesopotamian documents, like the Code of Ashuna and the Code of Hammurabi, who you might have heard of before. They also have lex talionis in them. They're about 500 to 700 years older than their biblical counterparts. But the deal was, if you inadvertently poked somebody's eye out, that they would get to turn around and do it to you. What do we think? On a scale of totally normal to totally brutal, where does this go? Pretty brutal. Sounds pretty brutal on its face. However, the idea behind it was incredibly progressive, because before lex talionis showed up in the Code of Ashuna, the Code of Hammurabi, the Torah, the world was much more brutal. Because if you inadvertently poked out someone's eye, they could come back and take both your eyes, and take the eyes of everyone in your family, and then burn your house to the ground, and then salt your fields so they wouldn't produce any more crops. The lex talionis, for the first time, says that there is a limit to retribution, and that limit, the punishment, has to fit the crime. So it's eye for eye. All of a sudden, not quite as brutal as we originally thought. Also, in at least the Code of Hammurabi and in the Torah, it probably was never practiced that someone would turn around and poke out the next person's eye. In fact, there's no archaeological or historical evidence that anyone actually practiced this law literally, where they literally took an eye for an eye. But the Code of Hammurabi sets up a payment system. It says, here's what an eye is worth. Here's what an ear is worth. Here's what a hand is worth. Here's what a foot is worth. And so eye for eye actually meant, if you inadvertently poked out someone's eye, that you owed them financial compensation. And again, it was financial compensation that was determined to be about the worth of the eye. So you're not taking everything the person owns because of this mistake or this thing that has happened, as terrible as it is, but the punishment has to fit the infraction. As I said, the Torah, the Old Testament, doesn't invent lex talionis, but the Torah does advance lex talionis a little bit further and make it a little more fairer, because in the Old Testament, something that the Code of Hammurabi did not include, the Old Testament says that all eyes are worth an equal amount. In the Code of Hammurabi, some eyes were worth more than other eyes. And you can tell immediately how that worked, right? Someone who was wealthy, someone who was important, well, their eye was worth a lot more than someone who was a servant or a slave. The Old Testament takes this miles ahead and says all eyes are equal. In fact, it specifically says that lex talionis was to be honored among Israelites, foreigners who live within Israel, and Israelite slaves and servants. All eyes are equal. Everyone is equal under the law. Kind of incredible, right? So again, this principle that on its face we hear eye for an eye, we immediately recoil and go, how barbaric, how terrible. Dig a little further, and it's like, oh, that sort of makes sense. And you can see sort of human society develop into a more just one. By the way, I always print out a coloring sheet every Sunday and put it up in Zach's treehouse, our children's area. The coloring sheet for this morning's sermon is wild. Lots of questions on the way home today. So there's a development. So it's, someone pokes out your eye, you get 5 eyes. And then it goes to no eye for an eye. And then it goes monetary value ascribed to an eye. And then it says all eyes are equal. And then Jesus comes along and he advances it even further by saying, you have heard it said an eye for an eye, but I tell you, turn the other cheek. Quite a bit further, right? One of the best sermons I ever heard on Turn the Other Cheek was Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who talked about living and leading the church in apartheid South Africa, and knowing that people had told the people who were suffering under apartheid for years, for generations, turn the other cheek. Oh, if someone's abusing you, the government's abusing you, just turn the other cheek. He said there's actually a little bit more bite to what Jesus says here. For in Jesus' day, if a Roman soldier were to come and strike a person living in Judah or Jerusalem, if they were going to hit them, they would hit them with the back of their hand, because that's how you hit someone who is lower in stature than you. You slap them with the back of your hand. And so if you're right-handed, you strike their right cheek. If they then turn their cheek and give you the left cheek, it's kind of hard to backhand someone's opposite cheek. You can't quite do it. And so Archbishop Tutu says that the person doing that had to make a decision as to whether they were going to open the hand and strike them as an equal or whether they were just going to walk away. The next piece to this teaching after turn the other cheek is Jesus says, if someone takes your coat, give them your shirt too. Well, in ancient Israel, when during the Roman occupation, the Roman soldiers were legally allowed to take your coat. They were allowed to. It was sort of like the British Army in America before the Constitution, right? They could quarter in your homes. They could come in and say, we're gonna live here. Roman soldier could come and say, Roger, I'm taking your coat, and you would legally have to give them your coat, but they were only allowed to take your coat. So then if you took off your shirt and handed that to them, if they went back to their military base with a coat and a shirt, they were going to be in trouble. And so they had to refuse the shirt. Tutu and others say that turn the other cheek is not just a blank check to allow yourself to continue to be abused and hurt. But there's a little resistance built in. But of course, it's a non-violent resistance. We're no longer talking about taking eyes from anyone. Now we're talking about forgiveness and grace. In Peter's first epistle, he's talking about Christ's suffering on the cross. And he says, of course, Christ's sacrifice on the cross is for us and for our salvation, but it is also, he says, leaving you an example so that you shall follow in his steps. It's meant to be something that we are meant to emulate. And how do we do that? In the next paragraph, when he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten. Jesus' ethic of justice and love did not leave room in it for retribution and revenge. It left some room for resistance, but not for perpetuating violence. And Jesus' ethic of love and justice was also not something that he was willing to talk about, but something that he was actually willing to do. And so the people who beat him, mocked him, stripped him, spit on him, and crucified him, he did not strike back on, but in fact, he died for them too. He loved them too. His death on the cross was every bit as much for the Roman soldiers as for us. Some of you will know this. My job before I went to seminary, I was a counselor and teacher at a wilderness residential treatment center for troubled boys. We took boys from 11 to 18 who had gotten into trouble, and most of them had been sent there by a judge. They had done something where they could either go to a juvenile detention center, be locked up, or they could go and try and be rehabilitated with us, and the judge would sometimes send some of these boys to us for that purpose. And one of the bedrock principles of this place that is sort of ground into me is that for people who are hurt and wounded, we have two options. The one option is we can take that woundedness, we can take that hurt, and we can make other people hurt with it. We can bring other people down. We can make other people feel that same woundedness that we do. Or option two, we can say, this ends with me. All this hurt that was laid upon me, I'm not going to perpetuate it on anyone else. The violence stops here. Before the boys came to us in this wilderness residential treatment center, they had chosen option one, and what we tried to instill in them over their 18 months with us was the opportunity to take option two. But it's not just troubled boys who go into the woods who are hurt and wounded. It's every single one of us. Every single one. You can't live life too long without having some hurt on our hearts. If you can't identify any hurt on your heart, congratulations. That's amazing. God love you. But for the other 99.9% of us, we have been hurt. Our hearts have been ripped out. And we have those choices between us. We can either inflict that on other people and keep it going, or we can say it stops with me. Jesus on the cross said, this violence stops with me. And the only thing after it is going to be love. And that is what we as Christians are called to put into the world. Look, retaliation and revenge, it feels good for a short while. Love feels better in the long term. All right, one last story, and it's a more recent one. It's from Friday. So Friday, Maddie asked if I would take her to the Cloisters Museum in New York. It's the museum that's dedicated to medieval Christian art on the north end of Manhattan. I've taken my kids there since they were this big. I hadn't been there since COVID, so she got me in a soft spot, so I said, yeah, sure. So I took her out of school early, and we drove into Manhattan to go to the Cloisters for the afternoon. And it was a Friday afternoon, and they're doing work on the George Washington Bridge, and so traffic was insane. The lead up into the George Washington Bridge was practically standstill. It took forever to finally get to the bridge, and then you know why, because they're closed down a lane or two, and so all these lanes have to go down into just a few lanes, and while we're going from all these lanes to just a few lanes on the bridge, I get cut off. But not in a, I mean, we've all been cut off. I have to say, honestly, this was an egregious cutoff. It was aggressive, it was fast, it was dangerous. I thought I was going to get hit, and I'm already stressed out for the last few miles being stop and go. I'm already up to here, and so this guy cuts me off, and so I go like this. I go just like that. And then I could see in the rearview mirror, the driver went. And like, so I'm ready to escalate at this point. And you ever have one of those moments where you just stop and like you're able to like talk to yourself and it's just like in a flash of a second? And so here's what I said to myself, Rick, you are about to give a sermon on not perpetuating violence and hatred into the world. And your daughter's in the back seat. And so I resigned and I waved. And I know some of you are going to ask. So I'll tell you. I waved with all 5 fingers.